April 17, 1947. The ship groaned beneath her feet, steel plates shuddering as waves struck the hull with rhythmic insistence. She stood at the railing, gripping the cold metal until her knuckles whitened, watching the horizon blur between gray sky and grayer ocean. Behind her lay Japan, ash and silence and the careful reconstruction of dignity from rubble. Ahead lay America, a word that still tasted of fire and surrender, of cities turned to light and shadow in an instant. She was 27, though the war had carved lines around her eyes that made strangers guess older. Her hair was pinned back severely, her coat buttoned to the throat despite the salt wind that whipped across the deck. Control was armor, restraint was survival. These lessons had been written into her bones long before the bombs fell. Around her, other women stood in similar poses, silent, upright, hands folded or clutching bags that held everything they had left. They were part of an exchange program, carefully selected, quietly approved. Cultural ambassadors, the officials had called them, though the word felt hollow. They were widows and daughters of a defeated nation, sent to learn English, to study American ways, to carry back knowledge that might help rebuild what had been destroyed. None of them had wanted to come. But refusal was not an option for women who had already learned that survival meant obedience. She thought of her father, who had died in the final days of the war, his last words a whispered apology she had not been there to hear. She thought of her husband, lost at sea 3 years ago, his ship swallowed without ceremony or grave. She thought of the careful way her mother had folded cloth around the few possessions she was permitted to bring, pressing each crease with fingers that trembled only once. "You will see strange things," her mother had said. "Remember who you are. Do not forget." The coast appeared slowly, a dark line that thickened into buildings and docks and the chaos of a city that had never been bombed. She braced herself for hatred, for jeers and spitting and the violence she had been taught to expect from victors. Instead, when they disembarked, there were only officials with clipboards, translators with patient smiles, and buses waiting to carry them inland. The silence of efficiency, the absence of spectacle. It was almost disappointing, this lack of drama. The first weeks unfolded in a blur of strangeness. They were housed in a dormitory attached to a university, given small rooms with beds that felt too soft, sheets that smelled of detergent instead of sun. The food was bewildering. Too much meat, too much sugar, bread that had no weight or substance. She ate carefully, forcing herself to finish each meal, knowing hunger was a luxury she could no longer afford to indulge. The other women did the same, their faces composed, their conversations muted. Classes began. English lessons in the morning, American history in the afternoon, etiquette sessions that felt like performances of a play whose script she had not been given. The teachers were kind, patient, smiling too much, in a way that felt false until she realized it was simply custom. They asked questions and expected answers, encouraged debate in a way that made her chest tighten with discomfort. In Japan, learning had been about listening, absorbing, reflecting in silence. Here, silence was interpreted as confusion or hostility. She forced herself to speak, her English halting and careful, each word a small act of violence against her training. But it was not the lessons that unsettled her. It was the men. She noticed at first in the hallways, a young American professor, passing with his arms full of books, stumbled and dropped them. Before she could move, another man, a janitor, judging by his uniform, stopped to help. They knelt together on the floor, gathering papers, and as they did, the professor spoke softly. "My father died last week. I keep forgetting he's gone." The janitor paused, then reached out and gripped the professor's shoulder. "I'm sorry, friend. That's a hard grief." The professor nodded, his eyes wet, and wiped them with the back of his hand, unself-consciously, publicly, as though tears were not a wound to be hidden, but a fact to be acknowledged. She stood frozen, bag clutched to her chest, unable to process what she had witnessed. Men did not cry, not in public, not in front of strangers. Tears were for women, for children, for private rooms where shame could be contained. Her father had taught her this. Her husband had embodied it. Even in his last letter, written days before his ship departed, he had written only of duty and honor, his handwriting precise and emotionless. It happened again and again. Each instance was a small earthquake, shaking foundations she had not known were fragile. She saw a soldier at a train station embracing another man, a friend perhaps, or brother, both of them weeping openly as the train whistle blew. Civilians walked past without staring, without judgment, as though this display was unremarkable. She saw a father at a park kneeling before his young daughter, tears streaming down his face as he pulled her into a hug after she had fallen from a swing. "You're okay, sweetheart. Daddy's got you." The girl cried too, but the father did not hide his own tears or chastise her for hers. They simply held each other, their sobs mingling with the laughter of other children playing nearby. She saw a man in church, she had gone out of curiosity to observe this American ritual, standing during a hymn, his voice breaking, tears running unchecked as he sang about grace and forgiveness. No one looked away, no one seemed embarrassed. The woman beside him handed him a handkerchief with a gentle smile, and he took it, nodding his thanks, and continued singing through his tears. Each time she felt something inside her shift and crack, like ice beginning to thaw. It was disorienting, shameful almost, to witness such nakedness. She wanted to look away, to grant these men the privacy they seemed not to want. But she could not stop watching, because beneath her discomfort lay a question she did not know how to ask. If these men could cry and still be strong, what did that mean about the strength she had been taught to value? But here, this man cried as easily as breathing. It happened again and again. Each instance was a small earthquake, shaking foundations she had not known were fragile. She saw a soldier at a train station, embracing another man, a friend, perhaps, or brother, both of them weeping openly as the train whistle blew. Civilians walked past without staring, without judgment, as though this display was unremarkable. She saw a father at a park, kneeling before his young daughter, tears streaming down his face as he pulled her into a hug after she had fallen from his swing. "You're okay, sweetheart. Daddy's got you." The girl cried too, but the father did not hide his own tears or chastise her for hers. They simply held each other, their sobs mingling with the laughter of other children playing nearby. She saw a man in church. She had gone out of curiosity to observe this American ritual, standing during a hymn, his voice breaking, tears running unchecked as he sang about grace and forgiveness. No one looked away. No one seemed embarrassed. The woman beside him handed him a handkerchief with a gentle smile, and he took it, nodding his thanks, and continued singing through his tears. Each time, she felt something inside her shift and crack, like ice beginning to thaw. It was disorienting, shameful almost, to witness such nakedness. She wanted to look away, to grant these men the privacy they seemed not to want. But she could not stop watching, because beneath her discomfort lay a question she did not know how to ask. If these men could cry and still be strong, what did that mean about the strength she had been taught to value? The moment that broke her came quietly, without warning, in a classroom on an October afternoon. The instructor was a middle-aged man named Mr. Peterson, a veteran who taught American literature with a passion that bordered on evangelism. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hands scarred in ways that suggested hard labor or combat. He spoke with authority, commanded the room with ease, and she had initially respected him for the discipline he maintained. That day, he was reading aloud from a novel, The Grapes of Wrath, he had said, though the title meant nothing to her. He read slowly, his voice steady, describing a family fleeing dust and poverty, carrying everything they owned toward an uncertain future. And then he reached a passage about a mother comforting her son, telling him they would survive because they had to, because survival was the only rebellion left to them. His voice faltered. He stopped mid-sentence, staring down at the page, his jaw working silently. The room fell quiet. The students waited, unsure. And then she saw it, a single tear sliding down his cheek, catching the light before he brushed it away with a rough swipe of his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick. "This part always gets me. My mother used to say something similar during the Depression. She'd tell us there was always tomorrow, even when today looked impossible." He took a breath, steadying himself. She was right. We made it. But reading this reminds me of how close we came to not making it. He looked up, meeting their eyes without shame. That's the power of literature. It makes us feel what we've forgotten. And that's not weakness. That's remembering we're human. She sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the others might hear. This man, this strong, capable man who commanded respect and authority, had just cried in front of them, and he had called it human. Not weakness, not failure, human. Something inside her chest began to unravel. That night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the other women slept. The dormitory was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the distant sound of traffic. She thought of Mr. Peterson, of his tears, of the way he had not apologized for them, but for stopping, as though the emotion itself was acceptable, even necessary, but interrupting the lesson was the only transgression. She thought of her father, who had died without weeping, whose last words had been an apology, but whose face had remained composed even as his body failed. She thought of her husband, whose letters had been devoid of fear or doubt, who had written only of duty until the letters stopped coming. She thought of the men she had known all her life, uncles, teachers, neighbors, who had carried grief and loss and terror behind masks of stone, who had taught her that to feel was to be weak, that to cry was to surrender. And she thought of the American men she had seen, weeping at train stations, embracing in parks, breaking down in church and classroom, who seemed no less strong for their tears, who, if anything, seemed more human for them. She sat up slowly, pressing her fangs to her face. Her fingers came away wet. She was crying. When had she started? She did not know. She tried to stop, pressing her palms harder against her eyes, but the tears would not obey. They came in waves, hot and relentless, carrying with them all the grief she had locked away for years. Her father, her husband, her city, her childhood, everything she had lost and never been permitted to mourn. She wept silently, afraid to wake the others, her body shaking with the force of it. And as she cried, she felt something she had not expected. Relief. Not joy, not peace, but the simple, undeniable relief of releasing what had been held too long. The weeks that followed were different. She began to notice things she had overlooked before. The way Americans spoke openly about their feelings, the casual intimacy of their friendships, the unguarded laughter that erupted in public spaces. It was not that they were less disciplined or less strong. It was that their strength came from a different place. They did not hide their humanity. They wielded it. She saw men argue passionately, then embrace afterward, tears in their eyes as they reconciled. She saw fathers kneel before their children, speaking to them with a tenderness she had never witnessed in her own father. She saw soldiers standing at memorials, weeping for fallen comrades, and civilians thanking them with tears of their own. And slowly, carefully, she began to understand. Strength was not the absence of emotion. It was the courage to feel fully, to acknowledge pain and joy and grief without pretending they did not exist. The stoicism she had been taught, the rigid, unyielding mask, was not strength. It was fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of judgment, fear of being seen as less than perfect. But these Americans did not fear being seen. They wept and laughed and raged and loved in full view of the world, and the world did not collapse. If anything, it seemed more vibrant for their honesty. One evening, near the end of her time in America, she attended a small gathering at Mr. Peterson's home. He had invited the international students for dinner, a gesture of hospitality that had surprised her. The house was modest but warm, filled with books and photographs and the smell of something baking. His wife greeted them with easy smiles, his children darted underfoot, and he stood at the stove, apron tied around his waist, stirring a pot with the same focus he brought to his lectures. After dinner, as they sat in the living room drinking coffee, someone asked him about his time in the war. He was quiet for a moment, his cup suspended halfway to his lips. Then he set it down, carefully. "I don't talk about it much, but I'll tell you this. I learned something important over there. I learned that pretending you're not afraid doesn't make you brave. It just makes you alone. The men who survived, the ones who came home intact, not just in body but in spirit, they were the ones who let themselves feel, who admitted when they were scared or sad or broken, who cried when they needed to." He looked around the room, his gaze landing briefly on her. "In my country, we've got this idea that real men don't cry. But I'll tell you, the strongest man I ever knew was a sergeant who sobbed like a child the night we lost half our unit. He cried, and then he got up, and he kept going. That's strength, not pretending you're fine when you're not." The room was silent. She felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time she did not try to stop them. She let them fall, quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Across the room, another student, a young man from Germany, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Mr. Peterson saw and nodded, his expression gentle. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're all just trying to figure out how to be human in a world that keeps breaking our hearts." When the time came to return to Japan, she stood once more at a ship's railing, watching the American coast recede into the distance. The sky was clear this time, the ocean calm, and she felt a strange lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with relief at leaving. She thought of the men she had seen cry, the professor, the soldier, the father, Mr. Peterson. She thought of the way they had not hidden their tears, had not apologized for their humanity. And she thought of the men waiting for her in Japan, her brother, her uncles, the boys who had survived the war and returned with stone faces and silent screams. She did not know if she could teach them what she had learned, did not know if they would even want to hear it, but she knew she would try, because she had seen something in America that she had not expected to find. Not wealth or power or even freedom, but the simple, radical courage to feel. The ship's horn sounded, low and mournful, and she closed her eyes. The salt air filled her lungs. The sun warmed her face, and for the first time since the war had ended, she allowed herself to weep openly, without shame, her tears falling into the vast ocean that separated two worlds. She wept for her father, who had died without crying, for her husband, who had written letters devoid of fear, for herself who had spent so many years believing that to feel was to fail. And as she wept, she felt something she had not felt in years: whole. Because she understood now that real strength was not the absence of tears. It was the courage to shed them and still stand, to break and still rebuild, to feel the full weight of being human and not flinch from it. The war had taught her nation how to endure, but America had taught her something more dangerous and more necessary: how to live. And as the ship carried her toward home, she carried that lesson like a flame cupped in her palms, fragile and fierce, determined to keep it burning even in the face of a world that would tell her to extinguish it. Because she had seen men cry, and in their tears she had glimpsed not weakness, but the truest kind of strength, the kind that did not hide or armor or pretend, the kind that simply, bravely, achingly felt. And that, she realized, was the only strength that mattered, the only strength that could rebuild not just cities, but souls.